Throughout the history of football, there have only really been a select number of teams which are referred to by a nickname as a result of how legendary, symbolic or important they were to the sport. Examples that come to mind include Hungary's national team during the 1950s, which was dubbed the Magical Magyars, Celtic's Lisbon Lions who won the European Cup in 1967, and River Plate's 1940s squad, which came to be known as La Máquina. There is another one though that predates all of the teams I have just mentioned, although this particular group of players, for some reason, doesn't get the attention that it probably should, especially when compared to the media attention that the likes of the Magical Magyars and the Lisbon Lions receive even to this day. As you could probably tell by the title of this video, I'm talking about the Austrian Wunderteam of the 1930s, which took the football world by storm and had an impact on not just the contemporary state of the sport, but also its future. In this video, I'm simply going to tell the story of one of football's first great international football teams, how they came to be, and its rather sudden and sad downfall at the end of the 1930s, when political factors beyond the team's control brought about its swift demise. If of course you go on to enjoy this video, don't forget, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But for now, here is the story of the Austrian Wunderteam. Our story begins 2 decades prior to the Wunderteam's first match, with the appointment of revolutionary English manager Jimmy Hogan, who I have made a video about in case any of you are interested, as coach of the Austrian national team in 1912. He had been introduced to Hugo Meisel, the head of the Austrian FA, when the referee in an Austria vs Hungary game knew Hogan and his footballing intelligence, and when asked by Meisel if there was any way they could improve their team, he recommended the Lancastrian as a coach. Meisel appointed Hogan on a 6-week contract in preparation for the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, but in spite of them crashing out in the quarter-finals to Holland by 4-3, the Austrian formed a rapport with the Englishman and kept him on after the tournament concluded. Both of them were footballing ideologists, and they would spend long hours talking about tactics and how to get the best out of their players. The dominant formation at the time was the 2-3-5 system, which had been propagated so fervently by the English, and whilst the two both agreed that nothing was wrong about the setup itself, they didn't think it was being used correctly, as there was a heavy focus on physicality and individuality rather than technicality and keeping hold of possession as much as possible. A passing game became the order of the day, taking inspiration from the Scottish passing model which Hogan admired, and it wasn't so much a keep the ball on the ground mentality, but rather a keep the ball at all costs mindset, as Hogan wasn't averse to his players resorting to sending long balls over the top of the defenders, just as long as they had a target and weren't mindless hoops up the pitch. After Hogan departed, Meisel continued to develop upon the ideas the two had come up with, by this point manager as well as head of the FA, although following a 5-0 defeat to South Germany on an icy pitch just after World War I had concluded, he asked his players whether or not they should give up their passing game. The overwhelming response from the players was no. In addition to them keeping their passing style of play going forward, what certainly aided the national team's plight was the growing popularity of the sport, especially throughout the 1920s. Vienna was described as the footballing capital of the European continent in some contemporary reports, and a professional league was set up in 1924, the first of its kind outside of Britain, with regular attendances of between 40,000 and 50,000 people at league matches. Football would form a key part of discussions amongst the intelligentsia and general populace in Viennese coffee houses, where attendants would talk about tactics and team prospects for future games, with each club in the league having their own cafe to discuss the team amongst themselves and members of the public. Indirectly, or perhaps even directly, those venues would prove to be one of the key factors in the creation of the Wunderteam, as a result of one of the customers' frequent debates whilst they were there, namely, who should lead the line for the national team. Although Meisel primarily used target man Josef Bican, something which aligned with his idea of the centre forward being someone who could bully defences and hold the ball up well, the coffeehouse regulars lobbied for a slim, tricky and unorthodox striker by the name of Matthias Sindelar to take Bican's place. Sindelar was named De Papierena, or the paperman in English, for his ability to weave in between defences with consummate ease, and his innate sense of timing and footballing intelligence led many to believe that he should become the focal point of something special. The national team did experience a few years of decent results with Bican as the main man up front, including coming second in the 1927-1930 Central European Cup, the first international tournament for teams in Europe, which was set up, perhaps coincidentally enough, by Hugo Meisel. However, the clamours for Sindelar to be picked got even louder as the years went on, and eventually in 1931 the manager relented and made De Papierena the main man, especially as by that point Uldil was 35, 7 years older than his main rival. Arguably, this was the final piece of the jigsaw that the Wunderteam needed, as from that point on, the team stepped it up another gear. And how? Sindelar became an unorthodox centre-forward, essentially foreshadowing the role that Nando Hideki would fulfill for Hungary's magical Magyars during the 1950s. He would often withdraw himself from the front of the attack, instead using his tactical intelligence to pick up space and initiate counter-attacks upon receiving the ball, no doubt aided by his agility, ball control and dribbling ability. Dubbed the Mozart of football, he combined all of this with a strong shot and phenomenal goal-scoring record, eventually scoring 26 goals in 43 games for the national team and 240 in 312 games for his club side, Austria Vienna. Essentially, he was the playmaker and goalscorer of the side, all rolled into one. In his first game as the undisputed first-choice striker, Austria played Scotland, who had beaten England 5-1 just 3 years prior and, as mentioned earlier, were the original inspiration for the fluidity of the Austrian team with their passing game. It was a masterclass from Meisel's men who thrashed their opponents 5-0, and it would have been more but for the heroics of the visiting goalkeeper, John Jackson, albeit it was a slightly understrength Scotland team who played that day. Regardless, it was the moment that the continent, and more specifically Austria, realised that it had well and truly caught up with the countries in Britain, although it didn't stop the British newspapers from attempting to convince their public otherwise. The team still played with a 2-3-5 formation, but they encouraged their centre-half to get forward whenever possible and were aided by Sindelar's movement on and off the ball to facilitate their fluidity going forward. They dropped deep when defending in order to instigate their deadly counter-attacks, and the inside forwards would play a key role in linking attack and defence, perhaps almost as much as Sindelar did. Starmen besides De Papierena included, but of course are not limited to, goalkeeper Rudi Hidden, who Arsenal apparently wanted to sign at some stage given his talent, Josef Simstik, the centre-half who had a licence to attack and spray long balls across the park with unerring accuracy, and Josef Bican, who would go on to score over 800 goals over the course of his career, including 535 goals in just 272 games for Sparta Prague. And I promise I'm not making that up. Their form became imperious with this newfound system, which was nicknamed the Danubian Whirl, as by the end of 1931 they had beaten Germany 6-0 away and 5-0 at home, and Switzerland 8-1, and by the end of the following year they had won the Central European Cup unbeaten. Their greatest test would come against England in December 1932, and although they succumbed to a 4-3 loss, their first since February 1931, they took the game to England and were praised for their attitude and style of play by the press, with the Times even going so far as to award them a moral victory. Over the next couple of years, the Wunderteam continued to dazzle across the continent, losing just twice and scoring 101 goals across just 31 games from 1931 up until the 1934 World Cup. They went into the tournament as one of the favourites, even though it was hosted in Italy, who, despite having a quality team of their own, would undoubtedly be aided by dictator Benito Mussolini throughout the competition. However, the country of Austria itself, hit hard by the Great Depression, started to experience political unrest and uncertainty around the time of the World Cup, which affected the team in the build-up to the competition. In their first match, they were only able to scrape past France in extra time, and Hungary were defeated 2-1 in the quarters, setting up a semi-final showdown against the hosts. Mussolini allegedly handpicked the referee for the game himself and wined and dined him pre-match, which probably had an effect on how the game turned out, as many decisions would go against the unlucky Austrians. Italy still played a fantastic game, as defender Luis Monti kept Sindelar quiet throughout, and Enrico Gaeta scored the only goal of the game to knock the Austrians out. Downhearted and defeated, they would go on to lose the third place playoff to Germany 3-2, and a decline was set in motion. From their semi-final clash against Italy up until May 1935, they lost as many games as they had done from 1930 up until the start of the World Cup. They did finally manage to get the better of England in Vienna in 1936 though, as they scored 2 first-half goals and won the match 2-1, and Meisel finally had his long-awaited victory over the Three Lions. Sadly, he wouldn't be able to revel in that victory for long, as in February 1937, having overseen just 2 more matches since that triumphant victory, Meisel suffered a heart attack and died at the age of just 55. One of the godfathers of Austrian football was gone, and the team dipped in quality, especially as Sindelar became more and more reticent to turn out for the national team amidst the rise in popularity of fascism, which he made no secret of his opposition to. They would only win 2 out of their 6 games in the 1936-38 Central European International Cup, as it was known by then, including losing to Hungary twice and Czechoslovakia once. Although in spite of all the chaos that was unfurling around them, they still managed to qualify for the 1938 World Cup by beating Latvia 2-1. Unfortunately, as German politics began to take a hold on Central Europe and eventually the whole world, Austria were caught up in the crossfire and the Wunderteam was forcibly put to an abrupt halt. In 1933, Adolf Hitler had been sworn in as Chancellor of Germany, and in line with his vision of a 1,000-year Reich, he aimed to make the Aryan race the predominant one worldwide. This required what was later dubbed as Lebensraum, translated literally as living space, and whilst global domination would be a tad far-fetched at that particular moment, neighbouring countries in Europe were well within their reach and power to take over. The first country he set his sights on was Austria, which was of course his birthplace, and in February 1938 the Führer invited Kurt von Schuschnigg, the Austrian Chancellor, to meet in Hitler's mountain retreat. After being on the receiving end of a 2-hour-long barrage of words from Hitler, von Schuschnigg was presented with a document of the German leader's demands, including that the ban on the Austrian Nazi Party would be lifted, which he had to sign immediately or face invasion. Von Schuschnigg signed on the spot, but a few weeks later he reneged on his agreement and arranged for a civilian vote on March the 13th as to whether or not the public agreed to a German annexation. Upon hearing this, Hitler signalled that an invasion should take place immediately, and on March 11th, when he received word of the imminent arrival of German troops into the country, von Schuschnigg cancelled the vote and resigned as Chancellor, telling the Austrian army not to put up any resistance. The next day, German soldiers marched into Austria and were greeted extremely enthusiastically by the public, who had set up a vast display of swastikas in anticipation of their arrival. Hitler promptly set up a Nazi government in the country, and the annexation, or Anschluss as it is more commonly referred to, was formally signed off on March the 13th. The vote which von Schuschnigg had promised would eventually take place on April the 10th, 4 weeks after the Anschluss, although of course it was heavily controlled and the result was a 99.7% approval rate. Austria were now officially a part of Nazi Germany and no longer an independently recognised country, which meant that, as would perhaps be expected, their national football team, league and FA had to be immediately dissolved. This caused headaches for FIFA since, as already mentioned, Austria were due to take part in the 1938 World Cup in what would have been the last chance for the Wunderteam to get their hands on the Jules Rimet trophy. They decided against inviting Latvia, the team that Austria had beaten, to reach the finals, and after England declined their invitation, the tournament went ahead with just 15 teams, meaning that Sweden, who were due to face the Austrians in the first round, became the first, and to date only team, to ever receive a bye into the next round at a World Cup. There were other far-reaching consequences of the annexation on football, such as Jews being excluded from all football clubs, which led to FK Austria Vienna losing half of its playing and coaching staff and seeing them being replaced by Nazi officials and/or acolytes, but that's a different video for a different time. In spite of the Austrian national football team ceasing to exist as its own entity, a match between Germany and Austria was scheduled to take place on April the 3rd in celebration of the unification of the two nations. However, it would also be a useful game from a practical perspective as well, since the Austrian players would now be a part of the German national team, who had also qualified for the World Cup finals in France. The importance of the Austrian team was widely recognised in Germany, with the Reichssportführer Hans von Schammer und Osten saying, quote, "Viennese football art and the Viennese football school are unique in the world, and we would be fools to destroy it." Close quote. Hitler himself, apparently, would insist that there would have to be a balance of 6-5 when it came to Austrians and Germans in the matchday team, either which way around. So Sepp Herberger, the German national manager at the time, saw it as an opportunity to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Austrian players and which ones would be best suited to playing in his team. The celebratory match took place in front of 60,000 fans in Vienna, who were fully expecting a diplomatic 0-0 draw and a celebratory atmosphere. Rumours would circulate after the game that the Austrian team had been told point blank to not score in order to maintain the event's cordiality, and it may well have shown during the first half as they missed several clear-cut chances, with Sindelar in particular, who had decided to play in this game, sending quite a few shots which he would probably normally have scored wide of the goal. Some have speculated that they missed so many opportunities because they were actually toying with the Germans, since their technical style of play was much more effective than the Germans' physical approach, and their dominance over their opponents, and of course future teammates, was emphasised as much, and possibly as diplomatically, as possible. However, after 70 minutes, the Austrians finally broke the deadlock as Sindelar pounced on a rebound to open the scoring and stun the spectators. Things would take yet another turn when Karl Sester, better known as Shasti, blasted home a free kick to make it 2-0, and he and Sindelar proceeded to celebrate wildly in front of on-watching Nazi officials. That would round off the scoring, but it was undoubtedly the Wunderteam's last hurrah, the final moment of brilliance before they were forcefully, and probably unwillingly, absorbed into Germany's team. 9 of the players from the Wunderteam were selected to play in the World Cup, although as you might expect, the camp was an extremely unhappy one. Tensions between the two sets of players were palpable, and they often refused to bond with each other at all, leading to what was essentially 2 separate teams competing together as one. Sindelar had refused to take part in the tournament at all, partly because he was aged 35 and on the cusp of retirement, partly as a result of Austria relinquishing professionalism in line with Nazi ideologies and reverting solely to all of their players being amateur, but mostly because, as mentioned earlier, he was an outspoken anti-fascist and opposed the Anschluss. Germany would go into their first round game against Switzerland as favourites to progress, but also at loggerheads, and after drawing 1-1, they lost 4-2 in the replay to exit much earlier than planned. Only once since, namely in 2018, have the Germans gone out in the first round of a World Cup that they qualified for, and the blame for this exit was labelled almost exclusively at the Austrian players, who were accused of lacking sportsmanship. It was a sad end to the Austrian Wunderteam, a group of players that were seemingly always on the brink of becoming the dominant force in world football, and probably were the dominant force in world football for a significant period of time, and had inspired and amazed nations and journalists across Europe, yet who became victims of extra sporting events beyond their control that prevented them from having the trophy cabinets that their talents deserved. It would somehow get worse for the Austrians, as on January 23, 1939, 9 months on from his goal and wild celebration against Germany, Matthias Sindelar, the key man of that side, stayed the night at his girlfriend's flat and wouldn't leave it alive. A carbon monoxide leak, allegedly at the Nazi Party's instigation, albeit it was probably more likely to have just been as a result of a blocked chimney flue, poisoned and killed both of them. Sindelar was aged just 35. Ever since the 1930s, Austria have only reached the knockout stage of a major international tournament twice, namely at the 1954 World Cup and at this year's Euros, and in spite of a smattering of world-class players every now and again, such as Hans Krankel, Ernst Ockwerk, and most recently David Alaba, they have never come close to replicating their feats during their golden age, and their best chance for a major trophy may well be permanently beyond them. However, their influence on teams such as the Magical Magyars, the Dutch total football team of the 1970s, and, perhaps indirectly, Pep Guardiola's Barcelona juggernaut of the late 2000s and early 2010s is clear. Elements such as the withdrawn centre forward, an emphasis on counter-attacking, attack-minded centre-halves, essentially defensive midfielders at the time, and a focus on passing the ball and retaining possession by whatever means necessary were arguably popularised and first used successfully by the Wunderteam, which is why they should be talked about much more than they currently are. And that just about wraps up today's video telling the story of the Austrian Wunderteam of the 1930s. If you enjoyed it, of course, let me know by dropping a like on the video and subscribing if you haven't done so already. And if you want me to cover any other teams or stories or whatever it might be, let me know which ones down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.